welcome to this experts panel about global clinical trials and localization in the life sciences. This panel is brought to you by Wordbee, makers of the Wordbee translation management system, which has a lot of special features just for the life sciences. It's hosted by me, Robert Rogi. My cohort, Tanya Faulkner, is not here today because she's globetrotting in the middle of the coronavirus. So she can't make it, but shout out to her. So in the next 50 to 60 minutes, we'll talk about how to efficiently run global clinical trials, maybe because we are missing a panelist. And we'll talk about localization in the life sciences and workflows and all of that stuff. And we'll probably talk a lot about the coronavirus and the global pandemic too. After the panel, my colleague Jaime is going to jump in and give a short demo of Wordbee. So the panel is, we're just going to be talking about subjects at hand, but afterwards Jaime will give a short demo. So if you're interested in seeing that, then you can stick around. And I think our fourth panelist just jumped in. Great. So for the listeners, if you have any questions or comments, you can use the questions box on the right-hand side in that little panel. We'll take your questions at the end or sometimes as we go. I guess it just depends on the question. And so let's introduce the three experts that are currently here. We have Anna Richards, and Ana Sofia Correia, Lana Rachkovskaya, and we may have Mark Campbell on as well. So let's, I'll give you a moment to introduce yourselves.
Okay, should I start first? So, Hi, I'm Anna Richards. I work at Vitaccess as a localization project manager, and we predominantly work on real-world evidence studies with a focus on rare diseases. I've previously worked at CROs as a project manager as well, and I predominantly work in the localization sector. So I'll pass over to Ana Sofia.
Thank you. I'm a freelance translator. I work with medical and pharmaceutical texts from English into Portuguese. I have worked for the past 10 years as an in-house translator and freelance translator as well. I specialize in clinical trial documentation and subject-facing materials, namely clinical outcomes assessments. I also work a lot with patient advocacy and health literacy organizations.
Cool.
And pass to Lana.
Thank you. My name is Lana Rachkovskaya, and I have over 25 years of professional experience in the translations industry, both quite interestingly on both sides, both translation and management side of things. And been working with clinical trials and pharmaceutical translations over the last 20 years. My experience includes working as a translator, interpreter in a medical and healthcare setting, also working in-house in production. I'm a senior level as well as training quality assurance staff, creating quality control procedures, grading translations, also teaching languages, project management training, designing workshops and translation technology, vendor management, localization, and creating glossaries for machine translation software, which was actually quite a while ago. I also served as a mentor on the board of directors of the New York Circle of Translators for many years. And my education and training is in translation and interpreting, linguistics, localization, and writing from various institutions, including in Institute of Foreign Languages in St. Petersburg, Russia, St. Petersburg State University, New York University, and somewhat Princeton University. Thank you for having me.
Awesome. So there's no shortage of expertise on the panel today. So we should do
hey, Robert.
just fine. Hello.
Oh.
Is this is this Mark,
Mark
Campbell?
It is indeed. I'm not on video cam because I'm having some internet issues, but hopefully you can hear me okay.
Yes, you can be the ghost in the panel.
Wonderful. You can imagine what I look like. Okay, so thank you so much for having me on your panel. So my name's Mark Campbell. I'm an executive vice president at a company called the MD Group, and the MD Group provides a number of patient-centered services from nurse patient screening to home nurse visits, as well as transportation and reimbursement issues. I've been in the industry 21 years. Prior to the role within the MD Group, I headed up global delivery for the accelerated enrollment division of PPD. So, and prior to that, was in the Synexus clinical research business. So, spent a lot of my time the last 8 years with sites and patients in global trials, both in terms of recruiting patients as well as treating them on study. Prior to that, I had roles in small CROs, Johnson & Johnson and Amgen. So got quite a varied background, and I'm looking forward to the discussion today.
Cool. All right. Awesome. So let's get started then. So Mark, actually, the first question that I have on here is specifically for you and everyone else that wants to jump in, but my understanding is that you have a background that's a little more on the clinical trial side of the localization clinical trial side thing. And so maybe you could just briefly describe what a typical workflow for operating a global clinical trial looks like, just in terms of, successfully executing a global clinical trial.
Fantastic. That's an hour-long question, so I'll keep it as brief as I can. Yeah. So I think one of the greatest things is that when you set out your trial strategy, what you need to have in mind is how you're going to localize it. So both the economic and health infrastructure of the countries that you're operating in, their treatment and medication practices. So, certainly from the outset, you're going out there to understand where the prevalence is in the disease and search for those sites which have access to the patients, or you're looking to bring in other expertise to find and place patients onto the study. So that would be, the first starting point is where's the prevalence and where will you find the patients? At which point you can start moving on to understanding the logistics of patient access, treating regimens in order to access patients who are either drug naive or not naive. So there's a lot of patient population that you need to bring into consideration. So from a resourcing perspective, it's understanding how you run global strategy, which is often done from central organizations, and how you then communicate that down to on the ground groups who are then tasked with localizing the strategy. And I know there's a lot of translators on the phone who are far better placed than I am on talking to that localization. But if you're from patient recruitment or informed consent, understanding what the ethic requirements are, and then translating central documentation and patient-facing and site-facing material in a meaningful way. And of course, localization and translation are two different things. So when you design global studies and global campaigns to recruit and treat patients, how you then translate that into meaningful text in the local language is very key. So, that's, there's so much you can talk about there, Robert, but I think initially what it is setting out your strategy, is understanding where your patients and your sites are, and then having a much deeper element in how do you get the global strategy down into local and national and quite specific countries, depending on their health and regulatory and ethics settings. And that's when your local teams and your local resourcing becomes essential, as well as your market access and market knowledge.
Cool. So one more overview question before we go deeper, and I think this one is for everybody. So who are all of the typical stakeholders from the from the local area all the way to the top? Like, who are the main stakeholders in a global clinical trial, including localization?
No one.
I don't know who wants to jump in there.
A really wide range. I mean, the pharma and the biotech companies themselves. The tools with this. Then we go into regulatory advocacy groups, the caregivers. I don't know if Mark, you want to jump in with just goes on.
Yeah, I can certainly add. I'm a patient guy, right, from my background. So I would say your number one stakeholder in all research is your patients. So you got to understand the backgrounds of the patients that you're wanting to bring in. And also understand the kind of regulatory, as you mentioned, and the local ethics. So different countries have different perspective on trials. So if you're looking to run a trial in Germany and you need to take x-rays or do anything where there's a radiological element to it, you have to understand that the timelines are much more exponential. From a patient perspective, you've got to understand, as I mentioned, what are the barriers to them in their local country to participating in a study. So do they have a belief system around whether clinical trials are good or bad? Do they have knowledge about research as an option to them? Do they have transportation? Are there social, economic, or healthcare constraints in the background? So you need to, at a local level, and building what Anna said, I think you've got to engage with your local regulatories, your local ethics, your patient advocacies, and really have a strong understanding of the market that you're going into. And of course, and I would always say this, you should always do research in a country in which is going to benefit from the drug when it actually comes out, not just where the patients are. So I think, of course, sponsors are, local sponsors are a key asset, and your prescribers and your investigators, the people, the doctors, the nurses, and the coordinators who are going to be key to executing the protocol. But you need to engage them to make sure that the study design is fitting for that patient population. So a lot to consider.
Okay, I think that was a pretty good overview. So, and then, all right, so let's jump in then to localization. So where does localization in clinical trials, global clinical trials fit in with all of this? And what does the process look like for localizing global clinical trials and maintaining linguistic validation? What does that look like?
I think that localization starts from the very beginning of the clinical trial, because one of the first things that have to be translated, for example, is the study title. And then the main research team has to work with the linguists to build glossaries and translation repositories to ensure consistency. For example, we all, I think, have had projects where the study title is either wrong or not exactly as it should be. And for example, the study title has to be translated since the very beginning. And so that's what I'm saying, that it should start from the very beginning. The involvement between the several stakeholders and the linguists has to take place from the very beginning of the trial. And
definitely, yeah,
there's something
Yeah, just to jump in, sorry, I'm just saying that one of the main things that we run is translatability assessments across the content to see how translatable it can be as well. Just to see sometimes there are elements which they can't be translated, they need a full cultural adaptation. And this is really key as well at the beginning, as Anna Sofia was saying, it's just to get it at the very, very start of a study so that it will then flow perfectly through to all the other variants in the different countries. But without these assessments, it can lead to quite a lot of difficulty in localizing into different countries.
Yes, I think that. Go ahead, Anne.
No, sorry. Just say, and the same document will not serve will serve different target audiences. For example, it may seem the same document that will be used with investigators and clinicians and with patients, but it both require a completely different set of terminology and text structure.
So if I may jump in also here, there's a lot that we, people don't see behind the scenes of what happens in terms of project management of projects like this. So we said correctly that yes, it starts with analysis and assessments on the project management side of things. And without that, it would be hard to move forward. So here is a stage where we also write up instructions for the entire production team that is involved here, including translators, editors, proofreaders, and such. And localization is one of the most important components here as well. So working together with all the parties to get the glossaries, put glossaries together and get them approved by the end client is also quite important at this stage.
Yeah, and I think they're fantastic points. And in order for global strategy to execute, it's got to also be a bottom up and not just a top down strategy. And if I just pick out an area that I understand well, which is patient facing advertisement and education material, is that with the best will in the world, you can create a global strategy, but the imaging that you use, and as Anna and Lana, a number of panelists have already pointed out, what may sound like a very good English strap line and quite a catchy term or quite a meaningful term doesn't resonate in local markets. Everything from imagery to the backdrops and then that localization. So it has to be built in the time frame of your overall timeframes to get that grassroots reflection, both from patients, from the market, and from your translators. And certainly within the MD group, that's when we work through our own translations, that's a key area that we're looking to understand is, does this resonate at grassroots? When it goes through ethics, is this going to make sense? Because time to deliver patients and finish trials are the most expensive part of research. And what you don't want is a false gun going off at the start with an ethics rejection because patient facing or site facing or any of your material isn't resonating locally. So I think the panelists have already made those points quite clear. So I agree.
It's interesting you mentioned marketing materials, because I think that in the broader translation industry, when people think about life sciences, they think about linguistic validation. And like back translation and all of this sort of unique workflow stuff. But I think Slater published recently, I think it was Slater published that I think it was 30% of the translations in life sciences are linguistic validation,
yes,
and then the rest are not. Sorry?
Yeah, I was just confirming that it was a report issued by Slater, yes.
Does that ring true? Like, does it seem to be like an 80-20 or a 30-70 split between like workflows that require back translation and then other types of translations that don't?
Yes, definitely. I think that from my experience, linguistic validation is the vast majority of linguistic validation projects involve back translation, but you see that the medical devices or RC, patients leaflets companies don't use back translation for those, and medical devices instructions don't. But in terms of linguistic validation, mostly in clinical trials and mainly in clinical outcome assessments, yes, backward translation and the full process of linguistic validation is a must. And yes, the vast majority uses that process.
Yeah, sometimes it's actually imposed by the instrument developer. So if it's a patient-reported outcome, the developer themselves will state exactly what methodology should be followed. And it can go a lot further than back translation. It will sometimes involve cognitive debriefing, which is actually testing the translation with native speakers, sometimes of a specific condition that the patient-reported outcome relates to, which really takes us to another level of testing the content to see if it is understandable and completely accepted by a certain language speaker of the native speakers, and in that, especially as well in that treatment area.
I think that's a fantastic point. And if we kind of go back to what the principles of research is, we're here to collect data which is ultimately going to be decided on whether the drug is passed or not, whether the drug is effective and safe. So you see that a lot with these instruments now, where either you can only purchase validated translated versions, or they're very strict on the 2 points you state, which is imperative to maintaining the scientific and statistical relevance of the data you capture. So I think that's a really good point.
Maybe we should delve up. You go.
I know, and we also see a lot of times that back translation is imperative, and oftentimes it's the regulatory requirement that we see for certain workflow that includes back translation, linguistic validation, sometimes more complex workflows to forward translations, and reconciliation and back translation as well. Sometimes it also involves actual conference calls amongst all parties involved, including the linguists, discussing what issues the client may have with particular translations, and those are being addressed during the call. Sometimes it's the fastest way to resolve those, kind of a workaround, what sometimes is a back and forth correspondence to avoid that. So we see various approaches, but usually, yes, it's not a very simple workflow, but rather, several steps that are involved in the process.
Cool. So maybe we can delve a little bit more deeply into cognitive debriefing, since I think we're all familiar with some of the standard back translation procedures. But so when did cognitive debriefing become a part of the industry, and what are the challenges of cognitive debriefing?
It has been around for quite a while, but it was only 2005 that the ISPOR guidelines were officially published, and then they talk about the principles of good practice for translation and cultural adaptation on PROs, the patient-reported outcomes. They set out the 10-step methodology, like the kind of 5-star guide, really, of what you should be doing for these PRO measures. And cognitive debriefing is done after back translation review analysis is complete, and this is the part where it can be tested on maybe a group of 5 participants, I would say, more than patients, because it could be with healthy respondents, or it could be with people with the condition that the PRO is covering. And the interviewer will ask them questions as in things like, could you rephrase this question? Could you rephrase this response option? So the participants themselves can then rephrase it and give a real insight into what they're understanding. And it's at these key moments that when it comes back to us, and we analyze it, I'm one of the analyzers of these cognitive debriefing reports, we can start to identify where the issues are, where there's usually quite nuanced misunderstandings, but still nuance isn't good enough. It needs to be exact, because these are giving us data that we need to pull, and it could be coming in from multiple countries, and we just don't want to risk that being incorrect in any way. And as we're analyzing them, we can see where there are issues. I can even say now, I've got a few examples in mind that Mark brought up, even like cultural issues. Like I've worked on a questionnaire that was quite personal. There's really personal questions in there, and we found in some countries that they just weren't willing to even answer the questions. So these cases, we have to go back to the instrument developer and talk it through and see how these can be rephrased in another way, because we're trying to see now, or we're starting to see now, more instrument developers taking on translatability assessments and seeing where the issues are going to arise or could potentially arise before they start translating them into different languages for large-scale studies. So yeah, that's just one of the examples. I mean, cognitive debriefing, for me personally, I think it's one of the best ways, because you meet with patients who have these conditions, and you get real patient centricity in the study. You've got their opinions, you've got their understanding, and you've fully localized to their culture. I don't know if anyone else has anything more to say on it. I could talk a while about cognitive debriefing.
One difficulty in cognitive debriefing, for example, is with rare diseases, because if you're talking about multiple sclerosis or obesity, there are a very big population of patients, a large population of patients. But for example, if we're trying to validate a questionnaire intended for someone with a rare disease, it will be extremely difficult to find even 5 patients so we can test the questionnaire. So that's one of
that is a challenge.
Yes, that's a challenge.
Yeah. As well as that, it's also a challenge to get a spread of like the right demographics. So you would want to go between age 18 up to age 100, and get a fair amount of people for different groups. So a good amount is usually five participants, and then range them across different ages, genders, occupations, and have a really good mix. So I found in other like previous PROs, they've gone out for a group of 10. That's usually worked quite well. But again, if you're working with rare diseases, it's really going to It's usually a mix of maybe half with the condition and half healthy participants. And it's another struggle if you work with PROs for children, because there's a lot more guidelines, because you're working with under 18s. And that can vary from country to country. So that's more of legal regulatory conditions as well. But in general, there's quite a lot of legal involvement in any of these type of interviews, because you do need to get consent at any point.
Wow. So does anyone want to add anything on cognitive debriefing, or? Because I find that fascinating, but yeah. Oh, no, okay. Well, so cognitive debriefing is kind of at the end of the process, right? It's towards the end. And we mentioned that that it's good to get localization involved earlier in a project than later, right? So like I guess my question is like, what is the trend or where's the trend going in terms of when does localization get involved, and like, is it always now that you're getting involved early, or are there still cases when there are problems that are created by not getting involved early? So where are we at with that right now?
It depends on who you're asking. So I'm more involved with real world evidence studies rather than clinical trials. And so I have a lot more of input as well in terms of localization, because we have a lot of more visibility across all the elements of, so for example, in our real world evidence studies, they're contained within an app or a device. So it could be a tablet or a smartphone, for example. And localization is involved in every aspect, from demanding ethics, submitting for ethics for each country, to the marketing strategies for patient recruitment, for having contact with the patient advocacy groups, for information on localizing correctly for a certain country as well. So for that one, it's very from the get-go, even from meeting patients and having patient workshops. It's just from the start, and we'll be involved in the protocol development as well.
Yeah, I was pick up on the protocol development, and I think certainly that's the key area. What we're seeing in the industry is a move away from what I was called like child raising techniques as a parent when you've not had a child before, where you just solve problems in a linear fashion, right? To actually reverse engineering a protocol. So we're looking at now of how do we keep patients on trial? How do we keep patients compliant to the protocol requirements? How do we get patients on the clinical trial? So how do we design a trial that's going to find and retain and maintain compliance on a study? And then we say, well, where is the population that we are looking for, and its prevalence and its cultural backgrounds? And then how does that make a difference, or economic or social backgrounds, whether pediatric or adult? Are we targeting parents? Are we targeting adults to participate in the trial? So really, I think the industry is making, or has made, great steps to reverse engineer the process of looking at the outcome they're trying to produce, and then at the outset of designing their not just the protocol, right, but also the drug. So the drug, you need 5 horse pill sized tablets 5 times a day. They're looking at, how does that even come into the effect? So to be patient-centered, you've got to be curing the illnesses and disease and unmet needs that make a difference, and designing trials which then produce the outcomes that we're looking for, which is good, reliable data. So I think there's been the word patient centricity, I think, has been flown around a lot. It's grown over the last 4 or 5 years, a bit like the word strategy, when people sometimes lose to understand the meaning of it. But I think that drive to be patient-centered, and with the 21st Century Cures Act coming in, where we're looking at the voice of the patient throughout drug development, is driving protocol writers, scientific teams, drug developers to really think about, right from the get-go, as Anna has pointed out, how are we going to take this thing that we want to produce and make it work in a local area? And I think both, whether you're looking at home administered products, whether you're looking at clinic visits or virtual trials, all of this now is coming in to the effect of planning a trial. Whereas before, I would say that protocols were designed in very small niche scientific teams, and then we would solve the problems in a linear fashion. So I really think the industry's shifted in a good way quite rapidly, and frankly, COVID-19 is almost accelerating that need to think up front about how we deal with the unexpected in trials in a localized way. So I think, to Anna's point, there's been really good movement in that area to be more foresight than retrospect fit.
And I think that from my perspective, for example, in translation of the clinical trial documentation, for example, the translator is no longer just the translator, the one who takes the English text and transfers it into the target language. We act more, and we're seen more as a consultant, because if we get a text and we say this doesn't work in our target population, and we are often asked to advise on that, and that's, I think it's a positive shift that is happening. We're no longer the last point in the localization and the documentation process, but we are active participants in the text elaboration.
I agree with Anna, Sofia. I think we see a lot more collaboration between various parties and clinicians as well during the translation process. I also want to say that we notice a shift towards using mobile technologies in clinical trials, like with patient diaries and various questionnaires that are now being filled out, online on mobile devices. So that's definitely has been a new component over the last several years that we've been working with.
Yeah, I mean, the stakes for these clinical trials are so high, right? Like, and not just because of life sciences, but the average clinical trial lasts like 13 years, I think, or something like this, or they can last over a decade, right? Yeah, so I guess it's important to get it right. So we have a little bit more time here, and Mark, you dropped in the COVID-19 reference there, and we should probably discuss COVID-19 and how that's impacting the localization industry, because I'm sure that that it's changing things for everyone. Yeah, where's a good place to start with that? How is the pandemic affecting clinical trials and the localization of clinical trials right now?
Perhaps I could open up with how it's affecting the trials and leave the other panelists to hit the localization. So I think number one, which is probably the saddest thing that we're seeing, is we're seeing either widespread cancellation or patient recruitment being put on hold. Obviously, we're dealing with a number of patient populations that are vulnerable, underlying disease areas, immune suppressed or immune compromised. So I think the first thing that we've seen is a real wind down in patients' enrollment, either delays in startup or cancellation of certain studies, particularly in areas where respiratory area, where obviously it can have a significant impact on the data and the outcomes. But it's also driving a huge amount of innovation, such as how do you take the drug, and this is the area which the MD group works in, is how can we now take the research into the patient's home in a protective way? How do we get research site nurse materials, IMP, back and forth between the patient and the site during a national and really global lockdown? So I think both trial patient logistics, access and continuity of studies, protocol compliance has been greatly impacted by this. And we've seen the FDA and the MHRA have been fantastic really in issuing emergency guidelines on how to deal with it. But in tow, it's now generating a lot of documentation, such as how do you convert a visit from the clinic now into the home, has a huge impact on your documentation. It then is going to need to be localized, and the education of patients from walking into a clinic to being dealt with at home or doing self-sampling and shipment. It's been a huge shift to a decentralized inpatient home or virtual model. So whilst it's driven some positivities, I think, around innovation, it's had a really bad impact on the onward development of much needed drugs for unmet needs.
Yeah, just to add to that, because I've moved from working in clinical trials to real world evidence studies, which are They are similar to clinical trials, but there's no intervention in terms of we wouldn't be giving drugs to patients. So that's a major difference between them. But it also means that the actual studies can still go ahead because all of ours are on personal devices. So, for example, participants can just do it, fill in the questionnaires from the comfort of their sofa and let us know how their treatment is getting on. But then for them, getting access to the treatment has changed. So we will start seeing a change in respect to that as well, because it's going to be affecting everyone trying to have access to your pharmacy or your pharmacy being open or having the drugs on hand because of logistics and supply. There is undoubtedly a knock-on effect. I think in terms of for localization, I think like Lana and Anna would probably agree, though a lot of us work from home anyway. We'll quite usually freelancers will tend to be based from home. So there's not been a massive change in terms of the linguist lifestyle, I would say. That it would just be on an individual basis, and obviously we'll start seeing effects when more people fall ill, and then that will be more of a noticeable difference.
We're definitely seeing an alley, and also, you know, projects starting coming in, some very slowly with clinical trials, but you know, hospitals definitely what I see on my end now with certain precautions being translated, as well as patients coming in and being discharged. So that's what we see coming in our end in the States here in our area.
Yes, from my experience, I see that projects are companies are slowly getting back to business now. Now that a few weeks have passed and the countries are facing the pandemic progressively, but the workflow has become has slowed down significantly because it's like just like Mark was saying, companies are focusing right now in COVID, and I'm afraid that everything else is what has been put on hold, let us say that way, and it will, for example, the MDR directive was postponed, the which was to become enforced in May, for example, was postponed to 2021. Everything else was postponed due to the pandemic, and I'm afraid that it will impact somehow the industry, the pharmaceutical and the medical and the research, mainly the research activities.
I think this will lead to a big push, though, on more digital solutions.
Yes. Yes, we see digital health and health apps, and even we've seen, but we were already seeing a bit of that with the transition to electronic formats from PROS, right, and the patient diaries. And yes, it will become even more significant now.
So which so the industry is responding to the situation with all these innovations, right? Which of these innovations or which innovations do you think are going to stick? So when this SARS-2 coronavirus thing is all over with, hopefully someday soon, and life sort of starts crawling back into normal, which innovations are going to last permanently or change the shape of some of these activities?
Health, definitely. I think the distance patient management and everything that it relates to, patient communication, patient visits, patient. I think the innovation regarding clinical trial, not directly related to COVID, but yes, I think what will stick is the ability to monitor patients at a distance.
Yes, I don't think it particularly is an innovation. We do interviews that we've been seeing in the psychiatric field, especially, have been taking place over a long period of time, but now I think it will only be the new one.
I think we see more of an increase in telemedicine and again digital health study apps to complement the clinical trials that are already going on, and also to kind of fill the gaps of the data that we're missing out on from not allowing patients to visit the sites.
And I don't know if... Oh, sorry, Mark.
No, please.
Oh, okay. No, I was just mentioning that I don't know what Anna's experience is, but for example, and we talked about cognitive debriefing in the past. One of the requirements for me, at least, is that cognitive debriefing should be performed in person, meaning with in-person interviews. And right now, I'm doing cognitive debriefing through FaceTime and WhatsApp and online apps, so it will improve, it will help a lot our process of cognitive debriefing, because we don't have to be in presence of each other to test a questionnaire, for example.
True. They say that a lot of communication is in our gestures and our movements, so you lose a lot of that if you're not face to face or you're just doing it over the phone.
Yes, but I understand. But we are all here watching each other,
True.
right? So
true.
And I agree with every comment so far, and I suffice to say that I don't think it's about which innovations will stick. I think what I've observed is a number of key innovations: home visits, telemedicine, remote monitoring. These are not new things. I think what this pandemic will do will make our future trials more robust to deal with a repeat scenario. And by that I mean is that if you do not need to bring a patient into a site, how do you do it at home? And I think what it will actually do is accelerate the adoption of the existing innovation. I think we will see more safeguarding built into the study designs with fallback positions, because what we're hearing, and there's so much unknown now, if we have a repeat or similar flare, we need to be able to continue drug development for unmet needs, and we can't be putting studies on hold for 6 months out of 12. I'm not suggesting that's what we're facing. No one truly knows at this stage, but I think it's certainly going to drive the adoption rate of these innovations. I think if you're working in the virtual trials, home care, or transportation part of the research, is a great opportunity for you to push your innovation and it stick. And you've seen, and we all know how conservative our industry is to the adoption of technology and innovation. We've seen a wholesale move within the MD group of a huge surge in home care, a huge surge in telemedicine, reviewing medical records remotely or centrally. And I think what we need to do is work on that and make it more wholesale, because the reason why these innovations were there in the first place was to remove barriers for patients to participate in trials, to make trials more accessible to a broader population, and to ensure that the burden on patients, who, as much as you give them full informed consent and background, it's not until they're on the trial with ePro and diaries and medications they understand the full burden. If you can then remove trips, remove visits that aren't needed, and really focus on the data that you truly need to collect in the most efficient manner, this outcome could be that we actually start truly designing patient-centered studies more wholesale. So I'm quite optimistic that what will come out of this is a huge benefit longer term for patients.
Definitely agree there. Especially something that we kind of look into as well is just even the burden of going to sites for some patients. It's really difficult. Depending on their conditions, it's actually quite hard to participate in a clinical trial, but a lot of them really, really want to be part of it. They want to enhance the treatments. They want to help in any way. But if you're trying to get someone who's maybe handicapped to get physically to a site, it's really hard. So again,
there's always two sides to that. There's always two sides to that coin. Is that the years that I spent traveling around sites and talking to patients, what always used to kind of fill my heart was these elderly patients who loved coming to the clinic because it might be their once or twice opportunity to get picked up in a nice car, driven, talk to other people, speak to the nurse. And I've seen trials where patients have been on for many years, to your point, Robert, like 15 years, 12 years in, and there was a particular study I worked on in osteoporosis. And I was once in the clinic and I was chatting to the lady and I asked her why she was in the clinic. And she goes, well, I'm only here for tea because I've been coming here for 15 years, but the study's finished. And as a company, they continue to bring the patients in. So there's a flip side to human interaction, which is we want to get a balance, which is why I like the concept of hybrid trials and elective site visits versus like mandatory site visits. Make it elective, because if you want to be patient-centered, right, you give the choice to the patient. You don't tell the patient that, you know, to be patient-centered, you've got to stay at home, you've got to do it on a device. But I certainly think this adoption of the technology is a wonderful thing to see in wholesale. I hope we don't swing too far to the wrong side, but actually build it in as an option and make these things truly available to our patients going forward.
Definitely.
And that brings me to the next question about certain age group for those studies, right? That we mentioned elderly people in terms of training them on the use of technology if they have to use it in this scenario. So how do you deal with that? And I know on our end we've seen training videos. I don't know how effectively this works for a certain age group or not.
That is definitely a challenge. In general, like the best way is with patient workshops. But again, things like instructional videos, having maybe their caregiver to, if they have a caregiver, of course, to follow the instructions and demonstrate for them. Again, in this time of COVID, is less likely to be holding patient workshops and things. So I suppose we'll have to be a bit more innovative and come up with some more solutions to make it as accessible as possible to any age group.
Wow. Does anyone want to chime in? We are running out of time, but maybe we should just drop in a mention here. So Anna Sofia, you're involved with the open source COVID medical supplies group on Facebook, right?
Yes.
Maybe we should, just drop a reference to that for everybody, explain what it is and how they can get involved.
Okay, so OSMS is it was one of the initiatives in the United States to create medical solutions facing the pandemics, and now it's turning into a global effort with almost 20 languages involved, and we are trying to localize and translate the guide and the website and all the guidelines to create medical equipment to several countries, and it's a voluntary effort. I'm the team leader along with another colleague of the Portuguese team, but there are many teams involved. There are many countries involved, and so we are now seeking for translators and also some expert reviewers who will review the translated texts and validate them in their own country. So we can put the documents and our guidelines in the hands of those who can actually use them and create the equipment. So we have a Facebook group. You can search it as OSMS, and we also have I can drop it in the chat if you want the link. And we also have the localization and translation group dedicated to OSMS. And then once you are boarded in the group, you're divided into your corresponding language, where you'll find everything you need to know. So everyone is welcome to join us in our effort to translate and localize the documents. I'll just go get the link and I can put it in the chat.
Cool. Yeah, I think that initiative is so cool. It's nice to see that people are like, okay, let's just see what we can do, you know. Okay, and then we do have an audience question here. To CFAS, how important is translation in making or breaking the FDA approval? So like for just specifically for the FDA, I guess. I don't know the answer to that question myself. So
yeah, there's no official guidelines on it, right. But there are, as long as it has followed the ISPOR guidelines, especially if it's for a patient-reported measure, and it has completed its final report as well, it's usually a good step towards FDA. But I mean, there's other factors. It's not the only factor. I think Mark would probably be a better place to.
I think everything probably has to be perfect, right? Like everything meaning the whole thing.
Yeah, but there's a lot of in terms of localization, there's a lot of targets that must be hit, and things like ISO 17100 accreditation should be there for each linguist who's taking part in the linguistic validation steps. They should meet the requirements of that standard, as well as performing the steps as well.
Yeah, I think ultimately under inspection, what any agency or regulator is looking for is that the results that you produce are reliable and repeatable, and therefore if translations need validation in certain steps, because what the FDA is ultimately looking at is data. And as they go through their inspection, they're looking to understand what are the business processes, the competency of the people, and the systemic systems that surround those business processes that are in place. So the outcome, the data they're getting, they can sit there and trust, which is why they have a vigorous inspection schedule on new drug submissions. So I think that's where the general principle to take away is you've got to be able to prove and that your work that you do in translations, that you can repeat that same business process and produce the same outcome, and you do that using adequately qualified and trained individuals. And within the translation and linguistic market, that requires us to produce certificates, do forward and back. There's obviously different mechanisms that are in place, but that's ultimately what the FDA is looking for in all walks of their approval.
Yeah, like a comprehensive sort of audit trail as well of everything that's happened in the translation steps. So I think, yeah, just as Mark was saying, have a full overview of what has happened from the start to the finish and the competences of each person who's involved in that.
Yeah, we actually just released the full audit trail part of Wordbee. I think it was already a couple months ago. So we're also pretty much acquainted, pretty well acquainted with being able to produce audit trails. Yeah. Cool. All right. Well, that was super interesting, and you know, it's like it's a bummer that we have this situation in the world right now, but at the same time, it's nice to see that we're innovating new things and trying to work our way through it. So kudos for doing that. And okay, so that wraps up the panel, I think. And now we're just going to like transfer on into this demo about Wordbee. So any attendees who want to stick around, Jaime is going to show, I think, how back translation works in Wordbee. He'll probably mention audit trails actually. But thank you so much for coming on as panelists. It was a very interesting panel, at least for me. I thought it was great. And yeah, so thanks for coming on. And you can stick around too. So I don't know if any of you would like to watch the Jaime talk, but
yeah.
Unfortunately, I need to drop, but it's been a pleasure to see you all.
And you too, Mark.
Bye, Mark. Bye, Mark.
Thank you, Mark.
All the best. Thank you.
All right. Okay. So so I will change the presenter to Jaime, and then I think we can all drop our videos, and we can drop our microphones and stuff. But thank you for coming.
Robert.
Hello, everyone.
Hey, Jaime.
Hi, Jaime.
Hello.
Okay, so I'm gonna change the presenter here to Jaime. Changing presenter. All right.
Oh.
You are now the presenter, and I'm dropping out, Jaime.
Thank you very much, everyone. Robert, can you see my screen? I hope so.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Robert. For as Robert mentioned, what I will try to show you today a couple of examples of workflows that will be very useful for the life science industry translation. And this is the back translation workflow, and another back translation more advanced with alternative translations. So, but before, I'd like to say a couple of things about Wordbee for those who doesn't know the system. And it's a cloud-based system, fully secure. It is the best thing about Wordbee for the life science industry is that you often have to deal with so many stakeholders, in-country validators, doctors, depending on your actual company and content. You have to coordinate high number of stakeholders in your projects, and Wordbee is perfect for that. It has the tools for everyone to work anywhere in the world, whether they are advanced CAT users, technology translation users, or whether they never touch a translation system. It has all the tools for everyone, for all levels. Okay, right now I will just jump right into the workflow demonstration. So I'm gonna create a new order as if I were a customer. So I'm gonna do it on behalf of Philips Trevo, and I'm going to I have a custom workflow, which is a back translation workflow example. Yeah. So I'm going to give you a reference, choose a deadline. Language is already preset. You can choose your languages here. And I'm going to drop a medical report I found on the web. Okay, so right now the system Wordbee is breaking down the Word file into segments, doing the word counting, just processing the file, looking up into the translation memories to see if there are any matches. And it's also creating a project, because I decided that with the given specifications, I want Wordbee to create automatically a project. I want also Wordbee automatically, let's go and see it now, and I will explain. So if we go to our orders, we can see the order just being created as if it was coming from the customer. I'll just open it. So we can see that it has created a project. We jump into the project, and we jump in straight away into the job section. We can see here that as per my workflow preset, it has created a translation step a back translation and a back validation step. So we can see that the back translation, the back validation are inactive because for the back translation to be active, translation needs to be finished. So, and it hasn't been started yet. It's not even assigned. We can see that it is proposed, I mean, an email is being sent automatically from the system to these 3 vendors. So we, for the purpose of the demonstration, and because there's no one at the other end, it's just fake people. So I'm going to assign this work to a vendor, so myself. So I'm just going to assign it to vendor A, for example. All right. Now this is assigned. So this is another good thing about Wordbee. Like, you can automate everything, but anytime you can just jump in and change things and manually decide if something has to be removed from someone and taken over to someone else. Okay, so we just save the changes. And I'm going to use another browser, Opera, to connect as vendor A, right? So I'm just going to refresh my screen, or better, just jump into the, sorry, just refresh my screen, and just going to look for my job, actually. Let me just look for my job. So this is the one. We're just going to open the translation editor. Right, so we can see here in the translation editor that some matches have been found in the translation memory. We can, as a translator, we can accept the job. So I'm just going to say yes. I accept terms and conditions, and I'm going to start on the translation. I could have sent a message optionally, but I didn't. Okay, I'm not a Chinese translator. So what I'm going to do now, as a project manager, I'm going to cheat a little bit and do machine translation on this actual job. So as if the translator had done the translation. So now Google is translating our Chinese job, and it's done. So I'm going to go back here and refresh my screen. And I will see now all the segments in Chinese. I'll tell you a few things about the editor, just a couple of things. For example, let's just do some edits from, I may edit this segment. Just another one here. This one too. We could, as a translator, we could send comments on a segment. Let's say that, I don't know, this segment, we think that the source is wrong, or we have a question. Yes, there is some problem we detected, so we could say wrong terms, for example. So we can send this comment, terminology questions. And we can actually address the comment, right? So I think I would just go back as a manager. Well, actually, I'm just going to finalize this job. So let's just say that this is all being done now, and just validate the right. Right, and as a as a project manager, I see this job is being done, and normally this second step will be done by some other vendor, but for the purpose of the demonstration, I would just pretend that this vendor is doing everything. So we are also going to jump into this. Now that we can see the job active and available to us, so we're just going to jump and start translation of this back translation job. And okay, is back translation project. So we now see Chinese and we don't see the English source, because that's the whole purpose, that we actually translate from the Chinese into English, so that we can actually compare, you know, in a third stage, we can compare both English translations and see if English versions, and see if the Chinese was any good, or you know, maybe that will give us a hint that whether there was any problem with the Chinese translation, or whether our source document was ambiguous, etc. So again, I'm just going to use Google or a machine translation, actually. So actually, rather than Google, I will use here Microsoft. So I will machine translate with Microsoft, and we will compare both versions. Okay. And now this third step, it was pre-assigned to a consultant, but we're just gonna look at it from here as managers. We can do that too. And we actually see both versions of the English. We can see there are some differences: workshop versus seminar, you know, so that's giving us some hints. One of the good things about Wordbee is that everything is traceable and you can get reports out of anything. So I'm just going to show you some sample reports you can get. So we can export some reports here. We have some preset reports. You can customize the kind of report you want to obtain. So in this case, I'm going to just use this one, document translation, revisions, and comments. And we want to have it for the English and Chinese. So let's just take a look at this Excel report. Right. Well, this is how it comes by default. You know, you can customize your colors, logos. You can make it have a better look and feel, your company information, etc. So this is just a really very basic plain format. And what we can see here are the segments, and we can see all the changes that happen and when those happen and who made the changes, right? So for example, we see that this segment was one of the ones that I edited during the demo right now. And this was the other segment that I did edit, right? The others I didn't edit them, so I didn't come up as vendor A, as you can see. And we can also see here in blue that any comments that we address during the translation process. So this is I think this is a very useful report, but you can actually get anything, any kind of information you want on these reports. Okay, so I'm gonna show you now another workflow, also a bit more advanced back translation workflow with alternative translation. So let me just go again to my create a new order. And now we will go for advanced. I'm just going to call it advanced back translation. Choose another deadline. Same. Drag. So put our source files here. We could have reference materials, instructions. I mean, there's all sort of things you can actually include in the order. And obviously, I'm just dropping one source file, but you can add all kinds of, you know, as many source files as you need, different formatting, different formats, special configurations. So let's just submit the order. and we can go and check the newly created order, the actual project that is being created with it. Let's go again to the jobs section. And we can see now that we have two alternative translations steps here. We have two versions of a translation. A third reconciliation step, workflow step, back translation and back validation, right? So for the purpose of the demonstration, I will now assign these translation steps to the vendors, and as before, instead of waiting. So let's just do so now. And we will assign this first translation to vendor A, for example. And the second translation, second version, we will assign it to vendor V. We'll save the changes. I mean, I think I'm not an expert here in life science, but you are, the audience, you guys are. And the idea is that having two versions of the translation will also let us know if the actual source is well defined, well understood, is ambiguous. So so this is, I guess this is one of the reasons, and also will give us two versions of translation to choose in a third step. So in order to do this, let's just machine translate these two jobs with different systems. So I'm not going to translate Chinese again as before. So one with Google and the other one with Microsoft. Okay, so both systems, both jobs have been translated right now. And we can check the progress here, and we can see that it's fully been done, the translation for this one and so for this one. And we could now, instead of logging as a translator, I'm just going to do it from here as a project manager, for demonstration purposes. And again, we can see the editor. Actually, we could do some edits, but sorry, I was meant to log somewhere else. I was meant to actually start a reconciliation job. So I'm just going to show you how it looks like in the reconciliation. So I will open the editor now, and we will see now the English source and the two versions of the translation. So we can actually compare and actually reconcile. We could display a third column with a version 3 to to merge both versions. But so this is the good thing about the multi-column editor. And I want to just go back to the project and talk to you more about this multi-column editor, and because there are things interesting to mention about this. So this is the workflow. This is the workflow we designed, and as a manager, I decided how many columns should be displayed for the vendors by default, right? And I could also restrict the kind of columns and the number of columns I want them to see. So, for example, by default, it comes with source and target language, but I could have added, I could have said that I also want to add any kind of information. Imagine that you are doing translation of something that has visual context, like, for example, you have images, you're translating products. Well, you could include like hyperlinks to graphics, or the actual graphics on another column, so it could be displayed next to the segment they are translating. So I think this is a very useful thing to have, and this can be they don't have to do, translators don't have to remember doing it themselves, opening columns or whatever. They can do it, but we can preset it for them, so it's easier. Also, they might not be very knowledgeable about Wordbee, so we do it for them anyway. So I think this is pretty much what I wanted to show you for today. I wanted to make it short and leave some time for questions at your end. So I don't know, Robert, did we get any questions? Did we receive any questions? Any questions?
Yes. So let's see here. All right. So we have a question here. So they're saying that some of their stakeholders are not translators or people who are not usually using translation systems. And they're wondering, yeah, because normally they have to copy paste stuff into a CAT tool, and often comments are left on PDF or in Word documents. And they're wondering if there's some way to collect this feedback in Wordbee and include it in the translation memories.
Well, yes. I will explain, because it's not exactly as so. I mean, I think this is something really common in the industry. You have translation professionals where subject matter experts, then they use translation tools. But sometimes you have the guy that knows everything, but he's not a translator. He wouldn't go in, he's a doctor or he's an engineer, and he wouldn't go into a translation system. So what you have to do, you just have to send them a PDF or a Word file, and they make their comments, they make their amends there, and then you have to copy paste. I've done this in the past. You have to copy paste in the translation memories. You have to copy paste into, if you already have done the DTP, you have to do it also on the target files. Right, we have something to help here in Wordbee, and if I go back quickly to, I'm just going to show you rather than say, but basically we can export a format that will be in Word or Excel, and it's in a specific file to display the segments, and they can just open a, this plain Word or Excel file and make the edits there. And this file is in a format that when it's imported back into the tool, it will actually update automatically the project memory and the translation memory. So this is a great thing for people who doesn't want to go into a translation system to do edits. So in a way, we cannot get a PDF with notes and capture it, but we have a workaround that is as good as, and we save great time to people using Wordbee for this purpose.
Okay. And then we have another question here, which is, can more steps be added to a project workflow? They often have more than 10 steps.
Yes, speaking to some customers, they sometimes mention that workflows for them can be really tricky and complicated. So you can add as many steps as you want. I mean, we can just keep adding more tasks to be done. Also, I would like to mention, I didn't mention before, but like we already have naming for task translation, reconciliation, back validation. People might use different names for these workflow steps, and it's all editable in Wordbee. So you can add as many steps as you want, but you can also rename the steps as per your own terminology in your company. So I'm just going to look in the chat if there's any more questions. Anything else you've seen? Did you get any other questions, Robert? I don't know if.
Oops, yep, I was muted. Does anyone have any more questions about Wordbee for the life sciences? If not.
Or anything else.
Well, yeah, or anything else, anything you want to ask Jaime, anything at all.
Yeah.
All right. Okay, I think that's probably pretty good.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
let's sign off with our video, just so we can bid everyone a proper adieu.
Yeah, I want to apologize if I won't too much during the demo, but just feel free to reach me anytime. You know, reach us. Thank you very much.
Yes, thanks everybody for attending the panel and for attending the Jaime's presentation. Yeah, get in touch if you have any questions about Wordbee, if you want to know more about it. We have a number of clients in the life sciences, and yeah, get in touch. So, thanks everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.